So in other words, when I meet somebody, like some of you I know, and some of you I've never met before. So if I'm in a conversation with one of you all for the first time, while we're talking, my brain is spinning through a little Rolodex file. Who's this person like? Who's this person like? Who's this person like? And then they'll pull up a card. And I'll say, oh, you're like my friend Fred, who I went to college with. And so then I make a guess. So then I say something to you that Fred would like. And then if you laugh or you respond like Fred would have, we've got some rapport going. We've got some simpatico going on here. But if it sort of falls flat, I'm like, oh, that didn't work. And my Rolodex starts spinning again, not the Fred card. Okay. I'm sure some of you are thinking this is how dating works, right? We meet people, right? And part of the process of being in a relationship and gaining intimacy is actually taking the time to let that person actually emerge and become their own Rolodex card, which takes a lot of patience and a lot of time. So that's transference. So the people who have taught transference best have been the psychoanalytic tradition. So the Freudians, the Jungians, they're the experts of this. They're so much better than everybody else at this, it's crazy. The problem is those trainings take an extremely long amount of time, and they're dealing with lots of different kinds of transferences and drive theory and the way that it's very, 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 very complicated. But that's the world of transference. Now let's put the two of them together, trauma and transference. Now what we get here is something that's much simpler but much more powerful. So when you're working with traumatic transference, we're going to be talking, you're only dealing with basically 4 transferential states and 3 variations of them. There aren't a lot of trainings for people who work with transference. And the reason is because because people generally think of the transference trainings, you've got to go through the psychoanalytic. And so you can train in all sorts of ways to work with trauma, all sorts of exposure therapies, not just our way of doing it. But you're going to find very few people actively let you work with transference. Okay? There are some ways that you can train as a therapist where you'll be taught a lot about positive transference. This is what happens when you do a lot of missing experiences for people doing developmental psychotherapy. You've got to be careful around that because you keep stepping in as what's the missed developmental experience, right? Is this good? Am I talking? Is this, everybody's nodding their heads with it? Okay. So if we play that role of the missing parent providing the corrective experience, we're inviting positive transference all the time. And so we've got to be very careful around that. So there are ways to work with that, and there are ways that people work with that. But this is also one of the reasons that that you can get all sorts of kind of group dynamic problems that tend to arise in and after these trainings, because you're playing with the happy half of transference, and you can't get the happy half without the unhappy half. It doesn't work that way. So for example, there was a study done with memory, and it was studying either episodic or emotional memory. There's 2 different literatures that haven't merged yet, and they were trying to see how good it was over time. And so they took a bunch of school children who had seen the Challenger that exploded in the mid-90s or something like that, and they wanted to see how good their recollection was. And they found that with the key central part of the event, their memories were very good, very reliable. I mean, these were kids at the time, and the study's done like 10 years later, and their memories are astonishingly good of the central event. All of the periphery, all of the details, all mixed up, and then the kids do what we all do, which is they confabulate. Then we fill in the gaps. We make it coherent by making up stories around it. So the center is clear. Our mind is saying what is significant. So if we're mugged at dusk, in New York, and there's 15 people running around, and certain music's playing on the radio, and there's a smell in the air. So what our mind will do when it takes that snapshot is it'll say, what's significant in this moment? And it may say, dusk, this smell in New York City. Or it may say what the people were wearing when they walked past. Or they may say what I was thinking of before this happened. You see what I'm saying? So 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 of these things will cluster together, and that's what's held, and it's held as if that's the truth. Those are the warning signals. Those become the environmental cues, the triggers. The other stuff, it just sort of degrades like normal memory, and then we just sort of make it up. And so we'll end up maybe changing the time of the year, or who was around, or what was happening, and that all gets distorted. Yeah. One more overview thing, which is that I've said to a number of clients a number of times that, hey, come in. Sure. And I think that many therapists who work primarily with transference think or say the same exact thing, which in some ways, when we're talking about working with transference, what you pay the therapist for is to stay in rapport with you, understand your view of the world and your experience, and don't buy it, right? So that's hard to do. You've got to do 2 things at once. You've got to create the full rapport. You've got to really actually be able to feel into what they're feeling and thinking what they're thinking, but not buy it at the same time. So kind of a thing that I'll say is everything that your client is saying is the truth. Everything, in the sense that this human being grew up, had these experiences, lives in the world, and this is how they interpret the world. That there's an organic truth to that. And on the other hand, you say to yourself, everything they're saying is complete fantasy and confabulation. And you've got to be able to hold both of those and be comparing those against what happens in the sessions, what's happening out in the world, and so on, all the time. Ethical issues come up around transference work continually. So if you hear a lot of what seem to be digressions into issues of ethics, they're not digressions, because as soon as we go into transference, people start fantasizing all sorts of things. You've got clients are fantasizing things, and if you're working with them in rapport with them, you're fantasizing things all the time. And so you've got to know how to deal in a territory where there's all these mutual floating back and forth fantasies, which is one of the reasons we have rules. Like, you don't hit your clients, you don't sleep with your clients, you don't sell your clients real estate. There's a reason for those rules, because we get so confused sometimes that we don't know what to do. So I'll just follow the rule here. So follow the rule, right? Yeah. So be good to jump into the next section now? To move to the next section? Okay. So this training is divided into 3 sections. And in the first one, we're going to work with procedural memory and transference. So how many people in the room are experts in Bowen family therapy? Okay. How many people are pretty comfortable and solid with Bowen family therapy? Great. How many people have heard of it, you studied it in school, you kind of sort of remember a little bit about it? Great. And who's never heard of Murray Bowen? Great, beautiful. Okay. So I'm going to give you a very, very simplified version right now. So I'm looking at you. I know there's more to it than this. So one of the things that we take from Murray Bowen, he didn't have the memory systems. We learned about memory systems in the 90s, essentially. I mean, we had little bits here and there, but we didn't really have clinically applicable implications of how the mind works with memory. Okay? The memory literature took 3 giant leaps forward in the 90s, the decade of the brain. So he had to deal with this problem. He specialized in working with families that had a high degree of anxiety in them. And he looked at patterns that formed in the families. And so he would typically find that you would have somebody in the family who's over-functioning, somebody who's under-functioning, another person who stands at a distance, were the main 3 roles that he identified. And he would talk about how they would, you can, some upset will happen from any cause for any reason. An upset happens, and very quickly, the underfunctioning person will become identified with the upset. Either they'll cause the upset, or an upset will start to grow, and then they'll jump in and they'll take it on. So the underfunctioning person, the identified patient, will end up suffering and holding anxiety very, very quickly. The overfunctioning person will turn into a caretaker and swoop down to try to help them. And the other person in distance or role backs out of the room and watches television in the next room while you take care of the problem, right? So he studied how these dynamics happen. And one of the things that he would say is, he worked with families that would have a schizophrenic child in them. And he would say, I'm not working with a family that has a schizophrenic child, I'm working with a schizophrenic family. Now, that can be taken too far because schizophrenia isn't simply an aspect of group dynamics, right? It has to do with brain chemistry and a number of things. But the reason he emphasized that all the time was you have to think systemically. So what you find happens, and what he mapped really nicely, is that families that have anxiety, when anxiety rises, people move to certain roles in the family. Anxiety is the trigger. So what we start with in the first part of this is we talk about the roles, because the roles are proceduralized. So we talk about the role of the caretaker, the identified patient, the distancer, and the outcast. And we talk about when under stress, we tend toward one of those roles. Some people were in a situation when they played one or two of those roles, and they've got some fluidity. Some people just had one role driven in the whole time. Now, when we work with the roles, we're emphasizing that they're proceduralized. They're habits. They simply go into a relationship. So if somebody is raised in a caretaker role, they go into a relationship and they simply begin caretaking the other person. Regardless of what anybody says, thinks, what their intentions are, they just start caretaking. So they're wonderful and they're bossy pants, right? And it happens all the time that way, right? If somebody's an identified patient, what happens is they move into a relationship and immediately they've got symptoms. These symptoms just occur immediately as soon as they go into a close relationship, okay? Other people can be very warm and nice, they go into a close relationship and all of a sudden they hold this emotional distance. Other people are just fine when they're friends, you move into a relationship and all of a sudden they begin to perpetrate against the person they're with, okay? So what we do in the first part of the training is we identify these 4 procedural behaviors, these 4 roles, and then we transference and countertransference. We show you how to work with a client, and we also how to work with yourself so that you become fluid around the roles. Nothing the matter with the roles. It's just that when you get stuck on them that it's a problem. Okay? It's great if you're a caretaker. Well, it's great if you can caretake very skillfully. But to become identified with I am a caretaker, that's a bit of a problem because you're losing choices. Right? So that's the first part of it. So we're going to work the same way as you worked with the no exercise. We work with these procedural things that you do over and over. So a really simple one is if you're a caretaker, you set up an exercise where you're the client is sort of a habitual caretaker, and you say to the client, I'm going to say something to you and you say to me no, and tell me what happens in your body. Okay? So I say to the client, help me, please help me. And the client, a lot of you all would just go, no, I feel fine, no, I feel some things. It's been ground into you that you're a caretaker, and that's your only role, very little fluidity, then when I say that to you and you say no, you may not be able to say the word no. You may not be able to say no without an explanation of why you're saying no, because it's just an exercise to help take care of your psychotherapist so they feel competent. Whatever drama, or you actually say no and they start to go into a stress state or a trauma state on the spot. So we're working right up against these habitual patterns of being, okay?